morning marks the third week that we're looking at a series of lessons that's based upon the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, 22 and 23. And whenever I started this series, I mentioned I had 12 lessons in mind, but it grew by one this past week. So we haven't actually, begun looking at the characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit itself. But there's some basic fundamental principles I think that are important to understand before we really start talking about these qualities. And so this morning's lesson kind of goes along with the first two lessons that we've studied, but I think it's an important one to point out, and it's the idea of winning this spiritual battle. Because basically what God is trying to do in our lives is create these characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit that we read about in Galatians chapter 5. And what Satan is doing is he's trying to keep those fruits from being produced in our lives. And so there's a spiritual battle that's going on, not only between God and Satan, but really the idea that we want to look at this morning is the part that we ourselves play personally in this battle. And what do we need to do to win this battle? What do we need to do to make sure that God has a greater influence over us than Satan himself? And so I think all of us understand, to possess these characteristics that we're going to study about, we have to battle. But not only do we battle against Satan, there are times when we battle against ourselves. And what I'm trying to point out and emphasize in this lesson this morning is this idea that our physical bodies are the source of our temptations. Why do worldly things appeal to us? It's because we're worldly beings. There's a part of us that is physical in nature. And so we need to understand this part of us, and we need to understand how we can overcome the lust of the flesh that Paul writes about earlier in Galatians chapter 5. Now, in Romans chapter 8, I'm going to read several scriptures from there to start with this morning. I want you to think about this contrast between being fleshly in our minds and being spiritual in our minds. And so in verse 5 of Romans 8, Paul says this: "For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." And so when we think about Satan tempting us and Satan enticing us to sin, what's he going to do? What's he going to use in order to accomplish that? And the answer is the flesh is what Satan uses to entice us to sin. And whenever we sin, the result of that is, instead of the fruit of the Spirit being produced in our lives, then we're going to be producing the lust of the flesh. We're going to be fulfilling the lust of our flesh. And so basically, I think what Paul is writing about there in Romans chapter 8 is there are one of two things that motivates us to do the things that we do. Either it's going to be our flesh, it's going to be the physical things of this world, or it's going to be our spirit. It's going to be being spiritually minded and thinking spiritually minded. And so why does, you think about it from the perspective of the world versus Christians, why does the world act like they act today? What's their motivation? Well, their motivation is the flesh. It's the physical things of this life and the appeal to those physical things that motivates them to do what they do. Well, why are Christians different? Why are we supposed to act differently and live differently? It's because we're supposed to be spiritually motivated, not controlled by the flesh or motivated by the flesh, the body of man, but rather by the spirit of man. And so the battle of Christianity is really, we have these two parts of it. One part is spiritual and one part is fleshly. And what we're trying to accomplish in this battle is we're trying to allow our spiritual side to control our fleshly side. The world's exactly the opposite, right? They're allowing their fleshly side to control their spiritual side. And so Paul says later on in Romans chapter 8 and verse 6, he says, "For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is at enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be, so then they that are in the flesh cannot please God." So we have this choice to make. Are we going to be fleshly minded, or are we going to be spiritually minded? And Paul says there in those verses, if we choose to be fleshly minded, we're basically signing our own death certificate. To be fleshly minded is to die. It's to be eternally separated from God. And if we choose to be motivated by the flesh, if we allow this physical body to control us, the way that we think and the way that the things that we do here in this life, then he says in verse 7 there, we cannot obey the law of God. We can't be subject to the law of God and be motivated by the flesh. And then he makes the statement in verse 8, we can't be motivated by the flesh and be pleasing to God. And so you have this idea basically in Romans 8, to be fleshly minded, if we're going to be controlled by the flesh, then the end's not going to be what we want it to be. The result is not going to be any good. But then he says this, later on in verse 13 of Romans chapter 8. He says, for if you live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of your body, ye shall live. And so again, the emphasis that I want to put on this lesson is we have two choices. We can either be motivated by the flesh, or we can be motivated by the Spirit. We can either be fleshly minded, worldly minded, carnally minded, or we can be spiritually minded. If we choose, now you put that choice out before us and you say, well, if that's all there is to it, what would we choose? Well, I'd say we'd probably choose the flesh, wouldn't we? Probably 99% of us would say, well, that sounds better, because it means more gratification now. It means less sacrifice and less self-denial. And so if it was just simply, are you going to be fleshly minded or are you going to be spiritually minded, there wouldn't be a whole lot of thought. But remember the contrast that Paul made there. He said, are you going to live or are you going to die? Okay, if you're going to be fleshly minded, you're going to die. You're going to choose death. But if you choose to be spiritually minded, then you're going to live. And so that's really the two choices that we have. Are we going to be motivated by the standards of the world, or are we going to be motivated by the standard of God's Word? Are we going to be motivated by culture, or are we going to be motivated by Jesus Christ? Are we going to live after the flesh and die, or are we going to live after the Spirit and live? And so the whole idea this morning is we want to notice at least three things that we need to do in order to win this spiritual battle, to be spiritually minded and not fleshly minded. The first one is we have to understand the source of our problem. And we've kind of highlighted that as we went through the introduction there. But basically what the Bible teaches us is that it's our physical man, it's our flesh that is subject to temptation. Remember in Matthew chapter 26 and verses 40 through 41, read the story about Jesus as he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. And remember, he takes his disciples along with him, and he separates himself from them, and he said, you guys wait here, and I'm going to go over there and I'm going to pray for a while. And so he does that, and in verse 40 it says, he cometh unto the disciples and findeth them asleep, and saith unto Peter, what, could you not watch with me 1 hour? And then notice the statement that he makes in verse 41. He says, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. You understand what he's saying there? You know, when we think about the side of man, it's the flesh of man that makes us weak. It's the body, this human body that we're in, that makes us susceptible to temptation. If I didn't have a worldly body, I wouldn't be or worldly things wouldn't appeal to me. But because I'm a worldly man, there's a part of me that's earthly and carnal, then those things have an appeal to my flesh. And so sometimes in our minds, there's this spiritual side that's, it's all in. It's saying, yep, we can do this, we're going to do this. But then you have the other side, the flesh says, wait a minute, not so fast. You forgot about me. And so what Jesus is saying here to Peter, did Peter want to fall asleep? When Jesus told him to wait here and to stay awake and to watch out and let him know if anybody's coming to arrest him, did Peter really want to fall asleep? Well, his mind didn't. His spirit was willing, wasn't it? But his body says, I got to have a nap. I can't take it. And so you have this idea of being willing in mind, but lacking in the flesh. You think about Jesus, and obviously, the Bible teaches us that Christ came to this earth and became a man. He took on flesh, the Bible says. And there's several reasons why he did that. One of them we read about in Hebrews 2 and verse 9. And the Hebrew writer says this. He says, we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels. Now notice why. He's talking about becoming a man, being made lower than the angels. He took on a fleshly body in order that he might suffer death. It's a deep and meaningful statement in and of itself, but why did Jesus become a man? There's a number of reasons why, but one of them is so that he could die. Okay, you can't kill God. You can't kill the Spirit of God, can you? So if God is going to die, he has to adopt the fleshly body so that death can take place. Well, let me emphasize to you the same idea. The flesh is what made Christ weak, isn't it? It's what allowed him to be subject to physical death. Without that body, he could not have died, physically speaking. And without the body of man, we cannot be tempted, physically speaking, fleshly. And so what is it that makes us subject to this temptation, the lust of the flesh that we read about in Galatians chapter 5? It's our physical man. It's not the spirit, but it's the physical man. It's the body itself. And so we have to understand that every day Satan is appealing to this fleshly man. He's trying to get us to follow the thoughts and the reasoning and the lust and the desires that we have. And then on the other hand, you have God, who every day is appealing to our spirit to become more spiritually minded. And those are the only two choices that we have. We have to make a choice. Are we going to be fleshly minded? Are we going to allow our flesh to determine how we live in this life? Or are we going to be spiritually minded? Are we going to allow our spirit to have control over our fleshly body? And all of us know it's a battle. I mean, it's not something that's just you can snap your fingers and it's over and it's done with and you never have to worry about it the rest of your life. And so understand our flesh. The second thing that I want to emphasize is something that Paul writes about himself in Romans chapter 7. And that is, all of us struggle with the fleshly man, don't we? All of us struggle with fleshly desires. That's why it's called temptation. Because it appeals. It's something that a person would enjoy. It's something that they would want to do if they were not being controlled by the Spirit. And so think about the language that Paul uses there in Romans 7, beginning in verse 18 as I read this. He says, "For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good that I would do, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. I find then a law, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. For I delight in the law of God after the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members." You know, Paul writes about this idea of the struggle, the struggle between the fleshly part of man and the struggle between him and the spiritual part of man. Did Paul battle against his flesh? Well, absolutely. You know, he talked about this idea like Jesus spoke of with Peter in the book of Matthew. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so it's not the will or the mind of man that's the problem. It's the fleshly man and the things that appeal to him. And so it's a real struggle for everyone. And you know, Paul himself pointed out, well, you know, I struggle with it too. Sometimes we have this idea, you know, people say, well, what's wrong with me? You know, I want to do better. I want to be better, but I'm not doing any better. And that's kind of what Paul was talking about there. You know, it's this idea that sometimes we get discouraged because in this battle that we're going through every day, sometimes those fleshly appeals and those fleshly lusts rule out the spiritual thinking, don't they? And so we have to be careful about that. We've got to listen to God and His appeal for us to become more spiritually, to be controlled by the Spirit, rather than listen to Satan and his appeal to become more fleshly minded. And of course, that's something that's easier said than done. But the thing that I want to emphasize is don't make any mistake about it. It's a battle that we're in. It's a constant conflict between whether we're going to live for the flesh or whether we're going to live for the Spirit. And so understand exactly what the source is of these problems that we're facing in this battle. The second thing that I want to emphasize this morning is understand the source of fleshly things or sins that we're battling. And I want to go to the book of Galatians, Galatians chapter 5. If you want to turn over there with me. In verse 17, Paul begins with this statement. He said, "For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would." So again, you have this idea that just as Satan is trying to keep us from producing the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, that's the context there in Galatians chapter 5, you have God who is trying to keep us from producing the lust of the flesh in our lives. And so you have this battle that's these things that are contrary one to the other. And if you read in verses 19 through 21 there in Galatians 5, you have this list of all these lusts of the flesh, these sorts of sins, fleshly things that we're battling against, that we're fighting against in our own lives. And so I think as you go and you look through there, at least this is the way that I did. I think there's three areas or three categories, three battlegrounds, we might say, that we're fighting with our fleshly man. The first area deals with sexual sins that are often committed in the flesh or by the body of man. And so notice in verse 19, he says, "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness." So he basically mentions four things there that deal with sexual nature of the physical man. And so one of those words, the broadest one that I really see in that list there is the word fornication. And I know a lot of times when we study this, I emphasize it, but it's a broad word. It has a lot of different areas that it encompasses. But it covers, it covers any sins that are sexual in nature that would deal with premarital sex, not being married and yet fulfilling that lust of the flesh. It even carries with it, the idea of incorporating adultery, which is when a person already has a husband or a wife with whom they're supposed to be having an intimate relationship, but they go to some other source to fulfill that intimate relationship. It covers the idea of homosexuality. It covers the idea of bestiality. And so there's just so many areas within that realm that this word covers, a very broad definition. And so we have to understand that it can refer to a lot of different things. Well, remember the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18. Two words there, but this is the best advice that you can get for fornication. He said, "Flee fornication." If you remember nothing else from the lesson, just remember those two words right there. Flee fornication. That means run away from it. And let me be a little more specific too. It means not only running away from people who would try to get you to commit fornication, it means staying away from places and environments and objects that are going to steer you toward that. It's not just the idea of you yourself get out of there, but stay away from this whole concept of fornication, whether it be a person who's trying to get you to give into that lust of the flesh, whether it be an environment that's creating that atmosphere, whether it be an object that is leaning your thinking and your passions more toward that way. Just get away from those things. And so then you have the idea of adultery, which is very specific. It's, again, when a person already has a husband or a wife with whom they're supposed to be having an intimate relationship, but they go outside of that marriage, that relationship, to fulfill that. Uncleanness, interesting word there. It just basically means morally impure. And it's the idea of seeing things that in the sight of God would be considered sexually vulgar. And so some of the things that immediately pop into my mind when I think about that, and they're not always labeled. You know, if everything that we had in the world today was labeled, had that label on it, we'd probably stay away from it. A lot of people would. But things like, you know, for women it might be something like, they're called a romance novel, which is basically literary pornography for women. A lot of these are. Probably not every one is. But it's the idea of being sexually vulgar. Language that is sexually vulgar. It could be, you know, humor, a joke, a sexual joke. It can be, you know, images of what our world labels as soft or hardcore pornography. Things that are sexually vulgar. Stay away from those things. And then the fourth thing that he mentions there is lasciviousness, which is just basically a lack of sexual restraint in any area. And so it could be something as simple as the way a person dresses. You know, if the way that they dress is sexually suggestive, if that provokes thoughts within other people, then that's lasciviousness. It can be something like, simply the act of dancing that's sexually suggestive. Our society has twerking, things that bring to mind the idea of things that are sexually suggestive in nature. So that's one of the battle areas that we're fighting as Christians. And there's 4 different words that Paul uses there to describe this area. The second area deals with sins that are, I'm going to say they're spiritual in nature because they really involve the idea of spirituality. And if you look in verse 20, 2 things that really pop out to me. He says idolatry and witchcraft. Well, what is idolatry? I know a lot of people say, I don't have a statue up on my mantel place, I don't worship a Buddha statue or anything like that, so I'm not an idolater. Well, an idol is something that it's not just something that's physical in nature. It's not just having a statue in your home or on your shelf or, on your dashboard of your vehicle. That's not just idolatry in that form. Idolatry is when anything and anyone else in our life is first other than God. And so it could be a number of things in this life. If we're putting people before God, then we're involved in idolatry. If we're putting our position in this world before serving God, then we have an idol in our lives. If we're playing at things in this life instead of putting God first, then we have an idol that is in our life. And so basically it's this concept, if God isn't first in our life, we're guilty of idolatry. There is someone or something that is occupying the place that God ought to occupy in our lives. And so it's spiritual in nature. The second word is the word witchcraft. Again, to us, we kind of think of it, think of brooms and pointed hats and things like that, but it's really a more involved definition in the original language. It involves the idea, especially the idea of potions in that day and age. And understand this, when a person was talking about a potion in that day and age, they're basically talking about drugs. That's what a potion was. And so a lot of times these people who practice witchcraft, you could go to them and they would give you this potion, this magic potion, and when you drank it, you became more spiritually minded. In other words, you saw things that you couldn't see before you drank that potion. You got a glimpse. The idea was you were getting a glimpse into the spiritual world. It was making you more spiritual in nature to partake of these. And so that's the things that we're battling. The things that would steer us away from God. There are things in our world today, that would try to give us spiritual guidance and direction apart from God. It's the same idea. And so we're battling sins of that nature too. Not things that are going to take the place of God in our lives. Things that are going to steer us away from the will and the Word of God. And then the third area The sorts of sins that we're battling against are what I'm going to call social sins. And basically, it's a broad list there of things that pertain to our conduct toward other people, the way that we treat and interact with other people. And I'm just going to blaze through this list here in verse 20 because of time's sake, but just kind of a quick definition. Hatred. Well, hatred is when you have a total lack of love for somebody in your life. The way that we interact with our fellow men. Variance. When we have a conflict with another person. Emulations. That's the idea of jealousy. Resenting what somebody has or what somebody is in this life. Wrath. It's when we unleash our anger, fits of rage upon our fellow men. You also have within there strife. That's basically the idea of selfish ambition, doing everything that we can to put ourselves in front of other people, to get ahead of them, so to speak. Seditions, that means just causing divisions, people who go about and try to create factions or divisions between other people. Heresies, that's when you have this opinion, and I really want to emphasize that word. You have this opinion, and you try to label it as right or wrong. An opinion is an opinion. It's just that. It's not necessarily right. It's not necessarily wrong. But when you try to get somebody to say, hey, here's what I think. I can't prove this, but here's my opinion, and here's what somebody else says. Don't you think I'm right? You want to choose my side? That's the idea of heresies there. Not doctrine, but opinion in nature. Envy. Wanting what somebody else has. And willing to do anything to get it. Willing to harm anyone in any way to get what you want. Murder. That's pretty self-explanatory. The unlawful taking of human life. Drunkenness. We think of it as only pertaining to alcohol, but it actually covers putting anything into our body that's going to alter or change our mindset without having an adequate cause to do that. And then reveling is basically just out of control. That's when you're unrestrained in your actions and your words against your fellow men. Now again, that's a lot of different things that are mentioned there in a lot of different areas, but it basically covers the way that we interact with our fellow men. And so understand what we're battling against. Those are the sins, the sexual sins, the spiritual sins, the social sins that we're fighting against every day of our lives. And so now we've understood what causes all these problems. It's the fleshly part, it's the physical side. We've understand the areas that we're battling against our fleshly men, the sexual, the spiritual, the social, and now we want to talk about, well, how can we be victorious? How can we be sure that we're going to win this battle between being fleshly minded and being spiritual minded? And so the Bible tells us, first of all, if we want to win, we've got to put the flesh to death. We've got to slay the physical flesh. In Galatians 5 and verse 24, Paul wrote this. He said, "They that are Christ have crucified the flesh with its affections and lusts." Okay, he uses this illustration, one that we know well as Christians. It's the death of Jesus upon the cross. What happened to the body of Christ upon that cross? It died, didn't it? In other words, all life was taken out of it. It didn't move anymore. It didn't act anymore. Now you can say, well, he was resurrected. And I know that's not what Paul's talking about here. He's talking about on the cross, the body of Jesus died. It was crucified. You know what we have to do as Christians? We've got to put the flesh to death, don't we? We've got to put the fleshly minded things, we've got to bury them. We've got to put them behind us. And if we resurrect that fleshly mindset, guess what's going to happen? Well, we're going to do the things, we're going to fulfill the lust of the flesh that Satan wants us to. And so we have to understand we have to be willing to crucify the flesh. The second thing that I want to emphasize we're going to have to do is we've got to pay attention to our surroundings. And Paul says this in Romans 13 and verse 14. He says, "But put you on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provisions for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof." Two things that he emphasizes in this passage. The first one is clothe yourself with the mindset of Christ. That's what he's talking about. Think like Jesus thought while he was here upon this earth. We look at the life of Christ and we say, how was Jesus so spiritually minded even though he had a physical body? And the answer is it was his mindset. It was the way that he thought. And so Paul says here, think like Jesus thought. Adapt this same mindset. Put on the mindset of Christ. And if we do that, he said, we will not make provisions for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. Do you understand what he's talking about there? We talk about this idea of sinning and doing these fleshly things. Where does that battle begin? It begins right here, doesn't it? It begins right in our minds, in the way that we think. I know probably all of us have seen the do not park here signs. Have you ever seen that sign? I think I've seen it once or twice around this area. But it says, don't even think about parking here. And the idea is this: if you don't think about it, you're not even going to do it, right? Get the thought out of your mind. Don't even let the thought enter in, and you don't have to worry about doing it. Well, it's no different when it comes to fleshly things. If we have the mindset of Christ, then we're not going to be making provisions. We're not going to be thinking about, well, here's what my flesh wants. How can I fulfill that lust or that desire? And so don't park near places that are going to make us think about fleshly things. Don't even think about it. So if we park near people that are going to provoke fleshly thoughts, that's going to lead to temptation, isn't it? If we park near places that are going to lead to fleshly thoughts, fulfilling the lust of the flesh, if we park near the things of this life that provoke fleshly thoughts within us, then there's a good possibility that we're going to do it, or at the very least, be tempted to do it. And so what can we do as Christians? Pay attention to our surroundings. Pay attention to the people that are surrounding us, the places, the objects, the things, because that has a great deal to do with the way that we think. And then the third thing that I want to emphasize, the last thing, is we've got to be careful not to become sloppy with our Christian liberties. And this is actually, we're going to talk some more about this, Lord willing, tonight in our study of the book of 1 Corinthians. But Paul says this in Galatians 5 and verse 13. He says, "For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh." Now, he talks about this idea as Christians. We have these areas where God allows us freedom, liberty to make certain choices. And we're studying on Sunday nights, the idea of eating meat offered to idols. That was one of the liberties or freedoms that the early church had. Is it right or is it wrong? Well, you're at liberty. God gives you this freedom. But just because you have freedom, it doesn't mean that it's always the best thing to choose what you want to do. And so what's Paul saying in this verse? Sometimes Christian liberties can get us into trouble. As a Christian, I have the liberty, and you can agree or disagree with it, but I have the liberty to drink whiskey whenever I get a cold. I believe I have that liberty as a Christian. It's medicine. I'm not using it for recreational, but it's medicine. The question becomes this: just because I'm free to do so, I have the freedom to make that choice, is it the smartest choice for me to make? You see, I can get sloppy with my Christian liberties, and making those choices can lead me closer to sin. What's the best choice for me personally as a Christian? Well, if I don't want to become an alcoholic, I'm not going to drink alcohol. That's the smartest choice, right? So use these Christian liberties in a smart way. I think that's a lesson we all need to learn that lesson, but that's a lesson we need to emphasize to our young people. Because sometimes young people, they come up with this idea, this thinking, well, I'm going to go here where this is present, but I'm not going to do that. Well, you may have that freedom. That may be a liberty, a choice that you have, but ask this: is that the smartest choice you can make? to be around people who are going to be doing this, to put yourself into an environment where these things are taking present. It may not be sinful in and of itself, but sometimes if we get too sloppy with our Christian liberties, it can lead us closer to sin and into sin. And so Paul said here, don't use your Christian liberties as an occasion for your flesh to sin. Don't put it in that situation. And so don't put it into an environment or a situation where it's going to thrive. We're in a spiritual battle. The Bible teaches us within ourselves there's a battle that takes place every day. And we have to understand what creates the source of the problems that we're facing. It's our flesh that's subject to temptation. We're struggling, Paul says, against the outward man. Understand the sorts of sins that we're struggling against. Sexual sins, spiritual sins, social sins, the way that we conduct ourselves toward other people. And then we have to understand how we can be victorious. How do we do it? We've got to slay the fleshly mindset. We've got to pay attention to our surroundings. And we have to be careful with our Christian liberties that they don't lead us closer to and into sin, but rather toward God. And I think if we'll do at least these three things, it's going to help us to win the spiritual battle. Maybe there's one here this morning who's not yet a child of God. The invitation